Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise to bring you the essential insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into a region that constantly dominates headlines, often, well, under the shadow of crisis, the West African Sahel. When you hear Sahel today, you might immediately think of frequent conflicts, political instability, pervasive poverty, and pressing environmental issues. It frequently seems like a region in a state of permanent crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
That's really our mission today. We want to peel back the layers of these contemporary challenges and explore their deep historical roots. To gain clarity on today's headlines, we're going back to a pivotal period, the early 20th century, specifically the years of French colonial rule, say, from 1900 to 1930.
Right.
By understanding this era, we can gain a much deeper, far less simplistic perspective on what you read in today's news about the Sahel. It's about seeing how much of what seems new is, in fact, an echo of the past. It challenges our assumptions about the present.
And to do that, we're drawing from some truly comprehensive historical material. We've got a fantastic blend of scholarship combined with direct insights from, colonial reports and contemporary observations from that precise era.
Those reports especially.
Exactly. They offer a unique, almost unfiltered window into the daily struggles and perceptions of the time. We're going to extract the core insights, showing you how many of today's seemingly intractable issues have some surprising and, frankly, stark historical parallels. Get ready for some genuine aha moments, I think.
Definitely.
So let's start with a fundamental question then.
Yeah.
What is the Sahel, geographically speaking?
Okay. Geographically, it's this vast semi-arid zone, think drought-adapted vegetation, and it stretches like a massive band right across Africa, from the Atlantic all the way over to the Indian Ocean.
Wow, that's huge.
It is, and you can picture it as this crucial transition zone, right? Nestled between the stark, unforgiving Sahara Desert to the north
Right.
and the lusher, more fertile savannas to the south.
Okay. And historically, what did that geography mean for the people living there?
Well, historically, this unique geography made the Sahel a really dynamic zone of contact. It's where pastoralist communities, those who rely on herding livestock, have always met and interacted with sedentary agricultural communities, the farmers.
Okay, herders and farmers meeting?
Exactly. And these interactions, well, they often fostered complex trade networks, cultural exchanges,
Episode conflict.
but also, yes, frequently led to tension and at times violent conflict over vital resources. Things like fertile land and crucially precious pastures and water.
Makes sense. Scarcity breeds conflict.
Precisely. Now, what's truly fascinating here is how the term Sahel itself has evolved. Its meaning has shifted over time.
So.
Well, initially, it wasn't this broad geographical descriptor we use today, not at all. You look at Arab chronicles as early as the 17th century, and they use Sahel, which comes from the Arabic style, meaning coast or shore.
Coast, like a sea coast.
Sort of, yeah, but more like the shore of the desert. They used it to refer to very specific places, often linked to the Songhai Empire, around cities like Gao and Timbuktu.
Okay, specific locations, not a whole region.
Exactly. And from Arabic, the word then entered local African languages, Bambara, Fulani, Tamashek again, often referring to specific localities. What's really striking is that 19th century European explorers, even though they traveled through these areas, they rarely used the term Sahel in their writings.
What did they use instead?
They overwhelmingly preferred Le Soudan.
The Sudan.
Yeah, derived from the Arabic Bilad al-Sudan, which means land of blacks. It was their term for the vast plains of West Africa. And this preference for Sudan continued in French colonial writings well into the first half of the 20th century.
That's a fascinating journey for just one word. So when did Sahel start to become the term we recognize today, this broader regional label?
It really started picking up steam in the first few decades of the 20th century, mainly driven by scientists. They began to popularize Sahel more broadly, especially its adjectival form, Sahelian.
Ah, like the Sahelian zone.
Exactly. It was an early scientific attempt to categorize the region's unique environmental characteristics. You had French botanists and scientists like André Auberville and Serge Frollo studying the region in the 1930s. They used terms like zone Sahelian or climate Sahelian to describe specific climate zones, even distinguishing subzones.
So a scientific definition taking shape.
Right. And at the same time, you had colonial administrators starting to use it in a slightly different, more political geographical sense. People like Paul Marty, he was an inspector of Islam. He'd referred places like Nioro du Sahel as this vast Islamized territory in what he called the Western Sahel.
Okay, so scientific and administrative use is creeping in.
Yeah, gaining traction, reflecting this growing awareness maybe of the region as a distinct entity, though the usage was still varied.
And then came the 1970s. That seems like a real turning point in how the world saw the Sahel.
Absolutely pivotal. It's a moment many people remember or have certainly heard about. It fundamentally changed the narrative. The dramatic drought that struck the region, particularly hard in Mali, led to just widespread famine.
A terrible humanitarian catastrophe.
It was, and it brought unprecedented global attention to the area. This was the point where the Sahel transformed in the global imagination. It went from being, just a geographical zone on a map to something much more politically charged.
And wasn't there an institution founded around then?
Yes, exactly. A key detail is the founding of the Sahel Institute in Bamako in 1976. This institute brought together countries like Cape Verde, Senegal, Mali, Niger, and for the first time, it defined the Sahel as a distinct geopolitical region.
Geopolitical, that's a key word.
It is, because it started attracting an entirely new level of focus from journalists, academics, politicians. And this reframing, this focus on it as a geopolitical region of crisis, well, it meant that future interventions, aid, even academic research, often approached the Sahel through this deficit lens.
So it kind of cemented its image as this perpetually troubled zone.
In many ways, yes. Sometimes overshadowing its incredibly rich history of resilience and dynamism. So when you hear about the Sahel crisis today, it's often viewed through a lens that was largely forged, you could say, in the crucible of that 1970s drought and the subsequent geopolitical framing.
Okay, that historical context for the term itself is really helpful.
Now let's transition to the French conquest itself,
Okay.
because it's crucial to understand this wasn't some simple, swift annexation. It wasn't just planting a flag.
Right.
No, to a very large extent, it was, a long war. A long war against formidable indigenous forces, particularly against powerful jihadist movements and established Islamic states that already existed there.
Right, this wasn't empty land.
Far from it. This French acquisition of the Western Sahel took place roughly between, say, 1850 and 1910. It was a period of sustained military engagement, integrating different parts of Africa into what would eventually become French West Africa.
And how did the local populations, particularly the Muslim clerics, react to this French expansion?
Well, it evoked a complex range of reactions, as you'd expect. Some clerics were more or less indifferent, perhaps even saw some advantages or reasons to support this new power. But many, a significant number, fiercely perceived it as a Christian attack on the Muslim community, the Ummah. And they fervently called for holy war, for jihad, against the French.
Before we dive right into the conquest details, could you maybe paint a picture of Islam in West Africa before the French arrived? You mentioned established states.
Yes, absolutely. It's vital context. Islam wasn't new to the region at all. It had been present since at least the 11th century.
Wow, that early.
Oh, yes. Initially, it was largely confined to the political elites and the merchant class, the ones involved in the trans-Saharan trade with North African Muslim states.
The traders brought it.
Largely, yes. But the 19th century, just before the main French push, saw a dramatic shift. This was the era of a really powerful reformist Islamic movement that just blossomed across the West African plains.
The reform movement, what were they reforming?
Well, it was spearheaded by influential Muslim clerics who openly criticized the traditional elites. They saw them as corrupt, their religious practices as impure, maybe too mixed with local traditions. And some of these leaders, names like Alhaj Umar Tall, Amadou Tall, Samori Touré, and Ousmane Dan Fodio of the Sokoto Caliphate became incredibly successful.
Successful how?
Politically and militarily. They created powerful, influential empires across West Africa, all under the banner of this reformed Islam.
So these were major powers the French had to contend with.
Absolutely. And what's crucial to remember is that while these leaders and their empires, they never formed a single united front against the French.
They didn't coordinate.
No, not really, but they all strongly opposed the colonial conquest individually. The French, even with their superior military technology, had to fight long and devastating wars to finally defeat them. It took time, cost lives, wasn't easy at all.
Okay, so that sets the stage. How did the French expansion actually proceed? What was the timeline?
Right. The expansion into the Sahel really gained momentum after Louis Ferrer became governor of Senegal in 1854. His initial aim was to push French authority into the upper Senegal River Valley. That's where he famously defeated the empire of Alaju Martal.
The Tijanea leader you mentioned.
The very same. Ferrer had ambitions to push further east towards the Niger River, but politics back in France under Napoleon III kind of stalled things for a bit.
Okay, so when did it really accelerate?
The pace picked up significantly about a decade or so later, particularly after France's, well, catastrophic defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871.
Trying to regain prestige.
Exactly. France was desperate to reestablish itself as a world power. Colonial expansion was one way to do that. So between roughly 1880 and 1910, the French launched a series of military campaigns. They came from their existing bases in Senegal, Algeria, and even Gabon down south.
What was the strategic goal?
The goal was to link these separate colonial holdings, push towards the Niger River, and eventually reach Lake Chad, create a solid block of French territory. This all culminated diplomatically in 1898 with the Niger Convention, which formally marked the partition of the region between France and Great Britain. Lines on a map.
And the actual conquest on the ground.
Key conquests included Bamako in 1883, Ségou in 1890, Timbuktu, a legendary name, in 1894, then Gao between 1899 and 1803, and Zinder in 1899. That same year, 1899, was quite dramatic. 3 separate French expeditions, one from Algeria, one from Senegal, one from Gabon, all converged on Lake Chad.
A race to the lake.
Pretty much. And by April 1900, they defeated the last major obstacle to French dominance in that area. Rabah, the Sultan of Bornu. So by the turn of the 20th century, the Western Sahel, basically from Senegal and Mauritania all the way across to Lake Chad, was formally incorporated into French West Africa, the AOF.
Okay, so formally conquered. But you mentioned earlier this gap between the official story and the reality.
Yeah.
How did the French talk about this conquest afterwards?
Yes, the official narrative. Early 20th century official histories, like one by André Le Guillet in 1913, they painted this picture. They depicted the creation of French West Africa as this great victory of the French civilizing mission.
It's a civilizing mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Bringing peace and security where there was supposedly anarchy, replacing tyrannical states with organized and stable administration. They even claimed it led to general welfare and that Africans were supposedly beginning to realize the benefits of civilized life.
Sounds a bit self-congratulatory.
Extremely. Because the reality, as you can clearly see from the detailed reports written by officials on the ground at the time, was, as they put it, much more complicated. In the early 1900s, large parts of the region, especially in the Sahel and Sahara zones, were still far from being a pacified or prosperous state.
So the official story was basically propaganda.
Pretty much. It was a convenient simplification. Designed to legitimize colonial rule back home in France and to the international community, it masked the fact that the French were constantly battling resistance, facing challenges, and imposing their will primarily through force.
Right, and that brings us to the structure of this new French colonial administration they were setting up. It was officially established in 1895, the AOF, but as you said, conquest and pacification were still very much ongoing.
Exactly, so the organization was complex, evolving alongside the military campaigns. At the start of the 20th century, the Western Sahel was formally divided between the colony of Senegal and this vast territory called Upper Senegal Niger.
Upper Senegal Niger.
Yes. Now, Senegal was mostly considered pacified by the late 19th century, but large parts of Upper Senegal Niger were still military territories well into the first decade of the 20th century, direct military rule.
Okay, when did the modern countries start to take shape within that?
That happened between 1911 and 1920. That huge Upper Senegal Niger territory was broken down into 3 distinct colonies. You got French Sudan, which is basically modern-day Mali, then Upper Volta, which is now Burkina Faso, and finally Niger.
Okay, and how is this whole structure run? Was it decentralized?
Oh, quite the opposite. The entire system was highly centralized. All the really critical decisions flowed from Dakar. Dakar was the prestigious capital of French West Africa, the AOF, and the seat of the Governor General.
The big boss.
The big boss indeed. Although technically reporting to the Ministry of Colonies back in Paris, the Governor General in Dakar wielded immense power locally, significant autonomy over finance, education, justice, even the colonial army station there.
Wow, very top down. But what about on the ground? How did this administration actually interact with the local populations day to day? Who was the face of French rule?
That's a great question because the real local power, the crucial figure on the ground, was the commandant de cercle.
Commandant de circle, head of the circle.
Exactly. Each colony was divided into administrative regions called circles, and the commandant de cercle was the French administrator in charge, often operating with just a small handful of French staff and some local auxiliaries.
So not a huge French presence everywhere.
No, often quite thin on the ground. And these commandants were in the most direct contact with the African population. Their responsibilities were vast. Enforcing laws and decrees sent down from the governor, collecting taxes, always crucial in maintaining order. And they had significant judicial and military powers backing them up.
How do they manage that with so few French staff?
Crucially, their authority, while definitely backed by French military force if needed, also relied heavily on the loyalty and cooperation of local native chiefs. These chiefs headed the villages, the cantons, and acted as vital intermediaries.
Indirect rule to some extent.
To some extent, yes. Without those chiefs, direct control would have been far, far more challenging, maybe even impossible in many areas. And this system, this top-down structure that was still heavily reliant on local intermediaries, well, it arguably created a legacy.
A legacy? How so?
Well, you can see how modern states in the region still grapple sometimes with establishing legitimate authority that extends meaningfully beyond the capital city, beyond the central power. And they often struggle with that very delicate balance of working through or sometimes against local traditional structures. It's a core challenge in today's governance issues.
That makes a lot of sense. This colonial conquest and the setting up of these administrative structures, they fundamentally redrew the map, didn't they? Divided the Western Sahel into borders that, with maybe only minor changes, are still largely recognizable today as the borders between modern countries.
Absolutely. They carved up the region.
And there's this ongoing, really vibrant, scholarly debate about the role these colonial borders play in post-independence conflicts. Many people argue they're a primary cause of instability, forcing different groups together or splitting others apart.
Yes, that's a very common argument, and there's certainly truth to it in many cases. But some scholars offer a more nuanced perspective. Take Pierre Boilly, for example. He's looked closely at the Tuareg insurgencies in Mali.
The Tuareg rebellions, right?
Exactly. Now, Boilly doesn't dismiss the significance of these colonial divisions, the way they cut across Azawad, the traditional Tuareg homeland, splitting it between Algeria, French Sudan, Mali, and Niger. But he suggests that the frequent Tuareg rebellions against the Malian state over the past 60 years aren't solely because of that colonial partition.
What else does he point to?
He argues that sometimes the colonial borders actually reflected existing divisions within Tuareg society between different factions or confederations. His theory is that the marginalization of Tuaregs, how they were treated and positioned within both the colonial state and then the post-colonial Malian state, was actually a more significant driver of these rebellions than the precise borderlines themselves.
That's a really interesting nuance. It's not just the lines, but how people within those lines were governed and related to the state.
Precisely. It makes you think, doesn't it? How do these historical decisions, drawing lines on a map, yes, but also the subsequent political and social exclusions, the way power was structured, how do they continue to shape present-day geopolitical realities and ongoing conflicts in the region? It's complex.
He really is. Okay, let's move into the direct challenges the colonial administration faced after the main conquests. You mentioned the reports offer a window into this.
Yes, the source material clearly shows the French were far from having a smoothly running, fully pacified territory, even by 1930. Those colonial reports, especially the annual political situation reports, are gold mines for understanding this. They're remarkably frank sometimes. They show French officials were constantly, almost obsessively monitoring African attitudes towards their rule, always on the lookout for signs of discontent or outright resistance.
And that vigilance wasn't just paranoia, right? They needed to be vigilant.
Oh, absolutely. Despite that official narrative of peace and civilization, the reality was starkly different. Many regions, particularly across that vast Sahel and Sahara belt, places like French Sudan, Mauritania, Niger, Upper Volta, required strong, often brutal military operations well into the 1920s and even the 1930s.
So pacification was an ongoing process, not a finished event.
Very much ongoing. This wasn't just occasional policing. It was a sustained effort to impose and maintain French authority by force. We have a striking and frankly disturbing example of this in the reports. The destruction of Domathian village in Upper Volta.
What happened there?
In December 1929, this village, mainly inhabited by Lobi and Barifour people, was seen as a center of fierce resistance. A French mobile detachment from a nearby post called Batier completely destroyed it, massacred its population.
Destroyed the whole village.
Yes, and the colonial reports themselves explicitly refer to this act as a severe lesson,
Mm.
and even more chillingly, as part of a plan of political sanitation.
Political sanitation. That language is horrifying.
It is. It was clearly intended to intimidate anyone else thinking of resisting. It drives home the brutal realities behind that word pacification. It really makes you wonder what the French genuinely believed they were achieving with methods like that, beyond just instilling absolute fear.
Fear is a tool of governance.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
They believed they were establishing order, making their rule undeniable, even if through terror. And it didn't stop there. Military detachments were still actively operating in that same area, the Circle of Batier, in July 1930, specifically to impose French authority.
So nearly a year later, still needing military force.
Yes, and the reports even show how they measured success. Tax collection rates, for instance, and even public participation in French national holidays like Bastille Day. These were used as direct measures of how pacified an area was.
So showing up for the French Flag Day meant you were loyal, or at least subdued.
Exactly. It wasn't just about revenue or celebration. It was about symbolically enforcing French sovereignty and assessing the population's submission. It's a stark reminder of the methods used to achieve that supposed peace.
Were there other kinds of conflicts reported besides direct resistance to the French?
Yes, absolutely. Beyond that direct resistance, colonial officials also reported frequent and often violent conflicts between different African populations. This was particularly common among the nomadic groups like the Moors and Tuaregs living on the desert edge in Mauritania and French Sudan.
Conflicts over what?
Often over vital resources. These weren't minor skirmishes. The reports from 1930 detail serious conflicts over things like wells in southeastern Mauritania. Clashes between different nomadic groups competing for scarce water sources, sometimes resulting in deaths and injuries.
Water is life, especially there.
Absolutely. And similarly, in the narrow circle of French Sudan, there were reports of Idabout nomads organizing into armed gangs, carrying out raids and plunder. Their chief was eventually captured and imprisoned for 15 years.
How did the colonial state respond to these intergroup conflicts?
Their response was often framed as resolute action. This involved both military intervention, sending in troops or patrols, but also, notably, judicial action. They made a point of using their legal system.
Action judiciaire. Why emphasize the legal aspect?
Well, it wasn't just about flexing military muscle. By emphasizing their ability to investigate, prosecute, and punish individuals through their courts, they were presenting themselves as the bringers of order and justice. It was a way to try and legitimize their rule in the eyes of the populace. See, we handled disputes fairly, unlike the anarchy before, even as that overall rule was maintained through considerable force.
Right, it ties back to that civilizing mission ideology again, replacing supposed anarchy with French justice.
Precisely. Even while suppressing traditional conflict resolution mechanisms or sometimes exacerbating conflicts through their own policies, like border drawing or favoring certain groups. This colonial intervention arguably ingrained a reliance on central authority for security, a pattern that echoes today in how disputes are sometimes managed or mismanaged.
Let's look specifically at Niger. You mentioned it faced particular challenges.
Yes, Niger stands out in the reports from this period. In the early 20th century, it was by far the least developed French colony. Least developed in terms of administration, infrastructure, education. A lot of its territory was still administered as a military territory, not under full civilian colonial rule.
Meaning the army was effectively the government in large areas.
Pretty much. Colonial authority often had to be supplemented or even just replaced by sheer military force. And the reports highlight persistent difficulties in controlling certain populations there.
Like who?
Well, the Fulani nomads, for instance. They were described as extremely mobile, neglecting everything that does not relate to their paddle. This made them, in the words of the French officials, difficult to command. You can almost picture the commandant's frustration.
The population just not interested in the colonial project.
Exactly, too busy moving with their herds. Then you had the Tubu people in the Nguigmi region near Lake Chad. They were actively resisting control. This led to French attempts to organize a particular intelligence service, specifically to monitor them.
Spying on them.
Basically, yes. And even sedentary populations weren't always compliant. People in the Manga region reportedly resisted French authority, especially the imposition of taxes and forced public works labor.
Forced labor was common.
Very common, yes. And then you have the fascinating case of the Buduma people on Lake Chad. They actively isolated themselves, retreating to the islands in the lake, refuging with passive stubbornness from the whole of administrative life, as one report puts it, successfully avoiding French influence.
So a significant chunk of what was technically French, Niger, was still effectively outside their direct control.
Very much so, which must have been incredibly frustrating for an administration trying to project total authority and order.
How did the French try to deal with that lack of control, especially in the more remote areas?
Well, this situation spurred further military action. For example, when the Italians launched their military campaign in neighboring Tripolitania, which is now Libya, that pushed the French to intensify their own military efforts in the Saharan part of Niger. They didn't want the Italians gaining influence or stirring up trouble, so they occupied strategic areas like the plateau of Jado and Madama, using loyal Maharist detachments,
The Harris detests.
special camel-mounted units, often recruited from nomadic groups considered loyal to the French, very effective in desert terrain.
Yeah.
And to try and assert and spread French influence in these little visited regions, the administration engaged in what the reports call constant military operations. This meant things like unexpected and rapid movements of the Maharist units to keep people off balance, also a very attentive policing of tribes, frequent surveys of the land and populations, and even using airplanes for overflying the plains.
Using air power that early.
Yes, for surveillance and intimidation. All of this was deemed necessary just to strengthen French authority in areas where their direct control was still really tenuous. It shows the French presence was very much an ongoing, active, often confrontational project, definitely not a settled peace.
And the long-term impact of all that.
Well, such a pervasive military presence, the constant reliance on force to govern, it inevitably bred a deep-seated distrust of state authority among many populations. That arguably contributed to the challenges of state legitimacy and effective governance that persist in some of these areas today.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly now to Islam. It was clearly a major force the French had to reckon with, politically and socially.
Absolutely critical. You couldn't understand the colonial experience in the Sahel without understanding the role of Islam.
And you mentioned earlier this fragile but functioning coexistence that developed between the French and Muslim authorities, despite past conflicts like Fader versus Umar Tal. How did that work?
It's a really nuanced situation. Despite those intense confrontations in the past, the French administration and local Muslim authorities generally did manage to find this mode of, let's call it, mutual respect and coexistence. Maybe pragmatic tolerance is better?
Why? What facilitated that?
Several factors. Partly, it was the existing religious structures. The region was dominated by three main Sufi orders, the Tijaniya, the Qadiriya, and the Muridiya. And at the local level, you had these clerics known as marabouts. They were highly respected figures, intellectual, spiritual leaders, heads of Quranic schools. They were key nodes in the social fabric.
So the French realized they couldn't just ignore them.
Exactly. They recognized that a direct, full frontal confrontation with these deeply rooted religious structures would be incredibly difficult, probably counterproductive, and certainly costly. So a more pragmatic approach often prevailed, trying to co-opt certain leaders, showing cautious tolerance towards others as long as they didn't preach open rebellion.
But beneath that tolerance, there was still suspicion.
Oh, absolutely. Intense and constant vigilance. Despite that relative coexistence, the administration kept a very close eye on Islam. This was largely driven by those historical fears, especially remembering the fierce Muslim resistance they faced in North Africa, particularly Algeria.
The Algerian experience loomed large.
Very large. So the French headquarters in Dakar paid meticulous attention to religious matters. They were constantly monitoring the behavior of marabouts, trying to gauge their attitudes toward what the French called our cause or our action.
How did they monitor them?
Through reports from the Commandants de Cercle, intelligence gathering. A 1924 report from the Podor Circle in Senegal, for instance, notes with palpable relief that there was no religious center hostile to our action. It adds that the marabouts there simply taught the Quran without engaging in any anti-French activities. Phew, crisis averted, you can almost hear them thinking.
Right, checking the are they against us box.
Exactly. Another report from the same Podor Circle, but later, in 1931, reveals how they measured loyalty. It talks about gauging the loyalty of the Muslim population by their willingness to send children to French schools.
Education is a loyalty test.
Precisely. It contrasts the Tukulur people, who apparently would send their children, seeing no incompatibility between French and Quranic education, with the Fulani in the same area described as recalcitrant, who strive by all means to remove their children from French influence.
Interesting contrast.
And the very fact that administrators regularly felt the need to report on the non-existence of fanatical marabouts speaks volumes. It reveals their underlying anxiety, their constant fear that some form of reformist or fanatical Islam could potentially challenge their fragile colonial order.
And you mentioned the Tijani Brotherhood was a particular focus of this concern, even if some leaders were loyal.
Yes, the Tijaniya specifically. That historical baggage from the fight against Al-Hajj Umar Tal in the 1860s was powerful. After that conflict, the label Tijaniya became almost synonymous in the colonial mindset with Muslim fanatics committed to jihad.
Guilt by association almost.
Pretty much. So even though many influential Tijaniya marabouts in the early 20th century were demonstrably loyal, collaborating with the administration, officials remained highly vigilant. They were wary because any reformist movement, even if primarily religious in focus, had the potential to mobilize large numbers of people. It could challenge the existing, often co-opted traditional authorities, and, from the French perspective, inadvertently sow the seeds of political unrest. That was the fear.
Could you give an example of how they reacted when such a movement did emerge?
A really compelling case study is the Yakuba Silla movement. It perfectly illustrates these fears. In August 1929, this man, Yakuba Silla, started preaching in Kaidi, a town in Mauritania. He was advocating for social and religious reform within the Tijaniya Brotherhood itself.
Reforming the reformers, in a way.
Sort of. And despite opposition from the established Muslim authorities there, which tells you he was challenging both colonial and existing African power structures, he attracted a really diverse following. Merchants, scholars, even former slaves were drawn to his message.
That broad appeal must have worried the French.
Immediately set off alarm bells, especially attracting followers across different social strata. The French authorities, already jumpy about anything that could disrupt their fragile order, saw this as a potential threat. Fearing it could challenge their authority not just in Mauritania but spread to Senegal too, they exiled him, sent him off to Ivory Coast.
Did that stop the movement?
Not entirely. His followers continued to spread his teachings back in Kaidi. This led to escalating conflicts with the local authorities and inhabitants who remained loyal to the established order. It all culminated in a violent suppression by colonial guards in February 1930.
Violent how?
The guards opened fire. Over 20 of Silla's followers were killed, and hundreds more were imprisoned or exiled across different parts of French West Africa.
A brutal crackdown.
Very. And the incident clearly shows the colonial administration's deep-seated fear. Fear that these kinds of reformist movements could spread rapidly, especially during times of hardship. They worried such movements could ignite widespread unrest by creating new, independent centers of power outside their control.
And did that fear link to the economic situation?
Yes, there was a perceived link. The suppression, even if successful in the short term, arguably contributed to a legacy of distrust between some religious leaders and the state, and maybe a tendency for states, even post-colonial ones, to view independent religious mobilization with suspicion. That dynamic is still observable sometimes. Even after Silla's exile, the 1930 political report confirmed his brothers, Kemba and Demba Silla, were being closely monitored back in Senegal, though it noted, perhaps with relief, that their followers were eventually quickly drowned in the mass of the Orthodox Tijaniya. But the anxiety was palpable.
And speaking of hardship, that brings us neatly to the broader economic crisis of 1930. The timing seems significant.
Very significant. The colonial administration's own reports confirm that the entire colony, French West Africa, was experiencing an exceptional economic crisis around 1930. This was, of course, hugely exacerbated by the global Great Depression, which had kicked off in 1929.
How did the Depression hit the Sahel specifically?
The most direct impact was the plummeting prices for the monoculture products the colonies relied on for cash, things like peanuts, oilseeds.
Their main exports became almost worthless.
Prices crashed, yeah, hitting farmers and traders hard. But the crisis wasn't just about global market forces. It was significantly worsened by harsh environmental conditions hitting at the same time, particularly an abnormal invasion of the locusts.
Locusts.
Yes. The reports mentioned that local people hadn't seen swarms like it in 30 years, and these invasions severely affected the subdesert regions, compounding the economic distress with severe food scarcity. Double whammy.
Economic crash plus environmental disaster.
Yeah.
How did the French administration react to that?
They observed these developments with considerable apprehension, as you can imagine. They explicitly feared that falling incomes and a widespread food crisis among the indigenous population would inevitably lead to anti-French feelings, or maybe demonstrations of disobedience, or even potentially widespread unrest.
Did those fears materialize? Were there big protests?
Well, here's a surprising fact. Despite these deep fears expressed in the internal reports, very few protests directly linked to the economic hardship were actually reported in 1930.
Really? Despite the conditions?
Apparently so. But the underlying anxiety, the constant worry about how Africans might react to these dire circumstances, that was a constant thread in their communications. It reveals a colonial power that, even when seemingly in complete control, was perpetually worried about its own stability, worried about the potential for resistance to ignite, especially when economic and environmental pressures combine like this.
It shows how important they saw economic stability as being for political control.
Absolutely. When livelihoods are threatened, the potential for instability rises dramatically. That pattern still holds true for many governments in the Sahel and elsewhere today.
Okay, let's shift now to those environmental concerns themselves, particularly desertification. You mentioned locusts, but there were broader worries too.
Yes, definitely. And a key figure in discussing this back then was an Englishman, Edward Percy Stebbing. He was a professor of forestry.
Stebbing, okay.
He visited West Africa between 1930 and 1931, and his observations became the basis for a really famous and quite alarming article he published called The Encroaching Sahara.
The encroaching Sahara. Sounds ominous.
Yeah.
What was his argument?
His core argument was dramatic. He claimed the Sahara Desert was slowly but inexorably spreading southwards, marching south, and crucially, he attributed this process primarily to human activity.
Climate change.
Not primarily, no. His focus was on indigenous, agricultural, and pastoralist practices. He argued that Africans were cutting down and burning tropical forests, bush, and savanna to create farmland and pastures. And this, in his view, removed the natural vegetation barriers that held back the desert, leading to soil erosion and the relentless advance of sand.
Was that a common view at the time? Blaming local populations?
It was a very common scientific theory in the 1930s and 40s, yes. The focus was heavily on deforestation as the driver of desertification, much more so than climate change as we understand it today.
Interesting. How significant did Stebbing think this encroaching Sahara was?
His warning was truly profound for the time. He was among the very first scientists to state explicitly that this environmental degradation, regardless of the precise cause, could actually threaten the existence of whole states in the West African Sahel, threaten both the French and the neighboring British colonies.
Wow, linking environment to state survival that early on.
Remarkably prescient, wasn't it? Given how central those links are in discussions today. He even provided a striking visual, a map where he tried to draw a line estimating the Sahara's advance. He figured about 1 kilometer per year over the previous 3 centuries.
1 kilometer a year. That's quite a march.
It is. His line stretched roughly from Nyoro in the west, across through Sokoto, Asongo, Tahua, Zinder, and over towards Lake Chad. And to try and bolster this argument, he offered what he saw as historical proof.
What kind of proof?
He claimed that lands north of this line, which were dry savanna or semi-desert in his day, must have once been green and fertile. He pointed to 15th century Arabic writings about the Songhai Empire, specifically King Axia Muhammad's pilgrimage from Gao back in 1496-97.
How did a pilgrimage prove anything?
Stebbing argued that undertaking such a journey with a massive retinue, hundreds of people, horses, donkeys, would have been impossible if the environment hadn't been much greener, more hospitable, able to support them. He also pointed to physical evidence he observed. Abandoned villages in French Sudan, ancient ruins in Niger between Tahua and Agadez, dating back to the 18th century, which he described as being literally overwhelmed by sand.
Okay, so he built a case. But were his theories accepted by everyone at the time?
No, not universally. Stebbing's ideas were definitely criticized by some of his contemporaries. For example, the French botanist André Aubreville, who also studied the region extensively, argued that Stebbing's picture was potentially misleading, maybe too alarmist.
How so?
Aubreville pointed out that some areas Stebbing might have considered desert, like the Azawa Basin, weren't purely desert even then. They still had pockets of vegetation, numerous wells, and could still support the big annual salt caravans traveling from Agadez to Bilma.
So a more complex picture.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of the issue in the scientific debate that was happening even back then, but it also shows us that the concern about the impact of worsening environmental degradation was a significant preoccupation for scientists of that era. Even if there's specific theories on the causes human activity versus climate shifts and the actual rate of progression differ quite a bit from our understanding today, the underlying worry about human impact was definitely there.
It's fascinating how these debates echo. Now, Stebbing didn't just look at the physical environment, did he? He also connected it to population and conflict.
He did, yes, and his observations on that are particularly insightful, especially when he made comparisons with neighboring northern British Nigeria.
Hmm.
In a place called Gaidam, he noted this really poignant fact. The population is actually increasing, while the means of supporting it are obviously and visibly decreasing.
More people, less resources. A classic dilemma.
A classic dilemma. He saw a similar trend in what he called the remains of the Great Bornu Forest, an area that was by then mostly dry savanna and semi-desert. He observed an increasing population and increasing numbers of livestock herds there, partly due to people migrating south from areas even further north where the desert's impact was more severe.
People moving south to find better land, putting more pressure on it.
Exactly. And crucially, Stebbing connected this environmental degradation and population growth directly to conflict. He pointed out that with more people and dwindling resources, the fallow periods for farmland became shorter. People needed land more urgently. This led to what he called land hunger.
Land hunger leading to fights.
Yes. He explicitly noted, and this is quite striking, that some of the last intertribal fights which we, the British, suppressed were undertaken to acquire fresh bush for cultivation. People were fighting over dwindling farmland.
Wow. Those observations from nearly a century ago, they sound incredibly relevant today.
Don't they? Discussions about resource scarcity, environmental migration, conflict over land and water. They continue to dominate headlines in many parts of the world, and very much so in the Sahel itself. It really makes you reflect on how deep-seated some of these challenges truly are. Their historical roots reach back long before our current climate debates even began.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, let's try and bring all these threads together now. We've covered a lot of ground from that 1900, 1930 period. What we've explored today, it really seems to reiterate a core argument, doesn't it? That the present-day crisis in the West African Sahel isn't some isolated event, not solely a post-colonial failure?
No, absolutely not. Our deep dive into that French colonial period clearly reveals that so many of the challenges we associate with the Sahel today, things like widespread famine or food insecurity, persistent political instability, intense resistance to state authority, underlying economic vulnerabilities, significant environmental degradation, these were already very much present and deeply problematic issues during the colonial administration. They weren't new problems that just sprang up after independence.
They were deeply embedded challenges even then.
Deeply embedded, yes. The French conquest and the way they set up their colonies in West Africa profoundly reconfigured local power structures. It wasn't just about imposing new borders on a map. It created the conditions for massive political, social, and economic transformations. Transformations whose effects continue to unfold right up to the present day.
So while the specific contexts have obviously changed dramatically between then and now,
Of course, contexts differ. But it's clear that many of the fundamental challenges, governance, security, resources, environment, show a worrying persistence across different eras. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, really understanding this history gives us a far more complex and more nuanced view of the Sahel. It's a view that challenges those simplistic notions of, African development or African instability that you sometimes see presented in the media.
it forces us to look beyond the immediate headlines.
Exactly. Look beyond today's crisis and consider the long historical arc. Recognize that today's problems are often the culmination or continuation of these deeply rooted historical patterns and colonial legacies.
So wrapping up, what does this all mean for us, for you listening? I think it means we need to approach the narratives we hear about the Sahel with a really critical eye. Recognize that the civilizing mission rhetoric used by colonial powers often serve to obscure the very real, often violent struggles they face just trying to maintain control.
The gap between rhetoric and reality was huge.
And it reminds us that peace or stability in any era, whether it's colonial, post-colonial, is often a fragile temporary state. It's usually achieved through very specific, sometimes quite harsh or brutal means. Understanding those historical mechanisms, how they dealt with conflict, economic pressures, environmental shifts, how they managed religious movements, all of that can illuminate the profound complexities of today's challenges in the Sahel.
It provides essential context.
It really does. It encourages you, the listener, to explore how a region's history, including its difficult colonial past, is absolutely critical to understanding its present state, and maybe to question any narrative that tries to oversimplify these incredibly complex global issues. Perhaps the final thought to leave you with is this. How often are the seeds of future challenges sown deep in the past, long before they eventually bloom into the full-blown crises we see today? Something to reflect on.